Who is D.B. Cooper has fascinated people ever since a man calling himself by that name hijacked Northwest Airlines Flight 305 back in 1971. People have come forward before claiming they know the culprit.
One of America's most well-known unsolved crimes may now be closer to being solved after more than 50 years of mystery.
D.B. Cooper, an independent investigator unraveling his infamous unsolved skyjacking, has obtained the crook's DNA. The identity of D.B. Cooper has continued to perplex investigators for the last 53 years.
Surprise. Suspect, someone no one anticipated, has been identified by new DNA analysis from evidence found on that tragic aircraft in 1971. It would finally be possible to question decades' worth of ideas, suspicions, and wild guesses. Could the narrative of D be changed by this small genetic hint? B. Cooper indefinitely? Now, should we give thanks to that one tie that was left behind? The D was rekindled by the DNA twist. B. Cooper mystery. For more than half a century, the enigma surrounding B. Cooper has floated between reality and legend. Every few years, a fresh breakthrough makes headlines. A confession here, a hidden parachute there, but nothing lasts. A man in a business suit takes control of an aircraft, but the case is still stuck in time. Demands $200,000, leaps into a stormy night, and vanishes forever. However, that quiet was disrupted around the beginning of 2025. The true crime community started to hear rumors that a small, private research team had discovered fresh DNA evidence on Cooper's recognizable black tie. For decades, that tie had been handled, examined, and even put on display. Earlier FBI testing in the early 2000s had produced no useful results. However, this new paper claims that improvements in DNA extraction and analysis have made the seemingly impossible attainable. Scientists claim to have found minute amounts of human DNA buried deep within the fibers, unaltered since 1971, using extremely sensitive microgenetic techniques. And that's where the chaos started. The DNA revealed partial matches to lineages associated with technological manufacturing and aerospace engineering in the Pacific Northwest, according to sources close to the investigation, who are primarily independent researchers and forensic enthusiasts. These specifics confirmed what has long been known: the discovery of tiny titanium particles from Cooper's tie were generally utilized in the manufacture of airplanes in the 1960s. Put differently, the person wearing that tie was not your typical office worker. He most likely worked with airplanes, possibly even building them. Rumors started circulating online, but the private group hasn't made names public. According to some, the DNA was connected to a Washington-based family of Boeing subcontractors. Others asserted that the match belonged to a military parachute technician who has since passed away. The FBI, which formally concluded the case in 2016, has declined to reopen it or comment on the results, and neither assertion has been confirmed. However, this hasn't stopped people from expressing their hopes or conversations. This is the closest thing to advancement for mystery followers in years. Imagine a DNA trail that leads to the person responsible for the sole unsolved skyjacking in the United States. The past. A man who, in spite of all the obstacles, disappeared completely, leaving only a necktie and a tail in his wake. Is it genuine, though? That's where the argument starts. There is disagreement among forensic professionals. According to others, it's quite possible that traces of DNA might endure, particularly if they are concealed deep within synthetic fibers. Others caution that any new sample might rapidly become unreliable due to contamination from FBI agents, lab technicians, museum handlers, and even inquisitive visitors over the course of 50 years. To put it another way, it may not even be Cooper's DNA. The so-called aerospace link is also unclear. Titanium particles do indicate industrial contact, but at the time, those elements were also utilized in tools, bicycle paint, and even copying machines. Therefore, even though the relationship with Boeing is exciting and romantic, it is still just coincidental. Nevertheless, The concept endures due to the mythology of D.B. Cooper is more than just a factual person. It's about what he stands for, an antiquated, rebellious mystery that has eluded modern technology. One name, an engineer who had previously worked for Boeing and vanished in the late 1970s, even briefly surfaced online before being discreetly removed. For a few days, the internet was ablaze with speculation that this might be the man, but no evidence ever came to light. The tale then fell silent once more, just like every Cooper led before it. Not dead, though. Never die. It's difficult to let go, even for some retired FBI agents. Speaking anonymously, a former investigator stated, "Every few years, someone comes forward with something. A photo, a map, a name, a sample. Maybe this time, you begin to think, but it vanishes once more." However, the chase is now a part of the folklore. Was Cooper a Boeing engineer who created the ideal escape strategy using his expertise in aircraft? Was he an accomplished parachutist with nothing to lose? Or was he just an ordinary man who became extremely fortunate and vanished into history, as some now suspect? In a while, we'll hear more theories. For the time being, let's recall how it all began 53 years ago. After hearing about Cooper's incredible mission, you might be able to make your own assumptions. Flight 305. The start of a legend. Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1971. One man wearing a black suit, a thin tie, and dark sunglasses was going to make history when the majority of Americans were thinking about turkey and pumpkin pie. He wasn't well known, he wasn't rich, and as far as anyone knew, he wasn't a threat. He appeared to be the type of person you would walk past in an airport and then forget about 5 seconds later. However, he would become legendary that evening. At Portland International Airport, he purchased a cash one-way ticket for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 to Seattle. He was hardly noticed by the ticket clerk. Air travel was informal back then. No body scanners, no TSA lineups, and no plastic baggies for your liquids. With a boarding pass and a grin, people could walk onto a plane. And this man did just that. Dan Cooper was written on his ticket. He chose a seat close to the back. 18C. After boarding, he smoked a cigarette. Yeah, you could do that back then. Ordered a bourbon and soda and blended in like a business traveler winding down. He was described by the flight attendants as composed, courteous, and even somewhat endearing. There was nothing about him that shouted criminal. Mastermind. However, something that would permanently alter aviation was hidden in his suitcase. He gave Florence Schaffner, one of the flight attendants, a note shortly after takeoff. She initially believed he was simply another man making advances on her. Without reading the message, she slipped it into her pocket. "Miss, you'd better look at that note," Cooper said, leaning in to whisper. "I possess a bomb." Her entire world turned upside down. He demanded $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck in Seattle to replenish the plane for his escape, all of which were written in clean, all-caps letters. Oh, and don't do any funny business. He partially opened the briefcase to reveal her wires, red sticks, and what appeared to be explosives in order to demonstrate that he wasn't bluffing. The events that followed unfolded like a film. Script. The airline hurried to comply with his demands when the pilots alerted air traffic control. But what about the passengers? They were unaware that a hijacking was taking place. Cooper ensured it. He instructed the staff to maintain composure, make everyone comfortable, and behave normally. Imagine yourself on that airplane, thinking you're only 30 minutes from Seattle, perhaps organizing your holiday dinner, while a man behind you is organizing one of the most audacious escapes in recorded history. Cooper's plan was underway by the time the aircraft touched down in Seattle. The passengers were discreetly released when authorities provided the cash and parachutes on the tarmac. None of them knew what had actually happened. However, the crew, he still held them captive. Cooper's new instructions were to take off once more, fly low, maintain a leisurely pace, proceed south toward Mexico City, and refrain from doing anything cunning. The pilots did as they were told, and somewhere over Washington state's thick forests, D.B. Cooper performed the unimaginable during a downpour. He dropped the 727's back stairs, tied the ransom money to himself, put on a parachute, and leaped into the night. No pursuit vehicles, no helicopters, no GPS, just a man and a bag of cash, fleeing into the storm. The worst part is that nobody has seen him since. Who actually gets away with pulling off a stunt right out of a James Bond film? What about the wild part? This was not a work of fiction. Into thin air. The amusing thing about D.B. Cooper is that no one gave him the name D.B. Reporters scrambled to cover the news when it initially surfaced, and in the meantime, a minor error changed the name on the ticket from Dan Cooper to D.B. Cooper. The legend began when the error stuck like adhesive. He is still referred to by initials that were never truly his. But isn't that tiny error quite ideal? Because no one has ever been able to fill in the omissions, errors, and half-truths that are the foundation of this entire case. The man boarded a jet like any other passenger, took control of it without firing a shot, and then vanished as though the clouds had engulfed him. Not a single person. No landing location has been confirmed. Not a single parachute remained. Just a question mark in the shape of a guy hovering over the Pacific Northwest. The FBI jumped right into the case with all the vigor you would expect. They examined every word Cooper had spoken, conducted witness interviews, and removed fingerprints from the aircraft. He wasn't some careless, nervous criminal. He was serene, even endearing. He offered them beverages and even paid his tab before leaping out of the aircraft, according to flight attendants who later described him as polite. Who carries that out? People began to wonder if Cooper was military because of his calm demeanor and very detailed demands. Former Air Force? A paratrooper? Perhaps even a renegade CIA agent? All of these theories were considered by the FBI, but they were never able to pinpoint a person. The suspects then appeared. The suspects, huh? The FBI followed up on over 800 leads throughout the years. Petty criminals, skydiving enthusiasts, veterans of the Vietnam War, and even a man whose family swore on their Thanksgiving turkey that he was the real Cooper, were all examined. The agency searched all around the nation for spirits, but nothing stuck. In fact, the FBI formally ended the case in 2016 following 45 years of fruitless attempts. Yes, the most well-known unsolved hijacking in American history, the S. In a technical sense, history is no longer even being studied. This is where the fun part of the narrative begins. The public took over the pursuit in the absence of the FBI. You name it. YouTube deep dives, Reddit threads, amateur detectives, and armchair detectives. Everybody had a theory, and some of them were completely bizarre. Was Cooper a dissatisfied worker for an airline? Given that Dan Cooper is the name of a comic book hero that is well known in French-speaking Canada, is this a Canadian comic book enthusiast? Alternatively, it's possible that he didn't get it through the jump at all, and that the mystery is actually just a man trapped in the Cascades. The problem is that each explanation reveals more about its proponents than it does about Cooper. He is viewed by some as a cunning anti-hero who outwitted the authorities. Others see him as a tragic figure who lost all of his big bets. In any case, he is now less of a man and more of a legend, an outlaw folk hero for the jet era. And for that reason, we still have the same question 50 years later. Who was D.B. Cooper? Because it's possible that someone has already discovered the truth if he wasn't just a nameless stranger with a parachute. Inside the plane, inside the plan. Assume that you are a pilot on Flight 305. It's a typical dreary November afternoon. You have a short flight from Portland to Seattle, a cabin that is half full of vacationers, And when you land, you're already planning your meal. Abruptly, a flight attendant enters the Seat 18C. Just handed me a note, she murmurs in the cockpit, her face pale. He claims to have a bomb. Yes, that's not precisely the message you're looking for at cruising altitude. At this point, everything takes on a bizarre, almost cinematic feel. Because the pilots weren't only sitting there thinking, "Oh, another passenger complaint." No, in a matter of minutes, they were talking directly with a hijacker who appeared to know exactly what to demand. 4 parachutes, a gasoline truck waiting in Seattle, and $200,000 in unmarked notes. It seemed as though he had read the playbook. It wasn't just a haphazard request. Cooper is fascinating because of this. His strategy appeared to be quite clever at first glance. He chose Thanksgiving weekend, when airports were packed and security was essentially non-existent. Keep in mind that this was before the widespread use of metal detectors. He requested a sum of money that banks could fairly collect in a timely manner. Not too much to stall, but enough to generate news. What about the parachutes? A brilliant move. By requesting 4, he raised the possibility that he may take a hostage, making it impossible for the FBI to destroy the equipment without endangering the lives of innocent people. That is pure chess thinking. Imagine this now from the perspective of the pilot. They arrive in Seattle. The passengers are gently disembarked, continuing to think that the delay is really mechanical. As they observe money and parachutes being put on the tarmac, they are informed, "Get ready to fly this guy south toward Mexico City." And lastly, he demands that the aircraft remain at 10,000 feet, with its flaps down and its speed low. That's not exactly smooth cruising, as any pilot will tell you. It's lumpy, raucous, and out of character for a jetliner. The strangest request of all is that the rear staircase be lowered in the middle of the trip. Now, the typical passenger wouldn't even consider that unless they were really familiar with the Boeing 727. Cooper, however, was aware that it was feasible. It was obvious that he had completed his homework or knew someone who did. The crew is sweating bullets from the cockpit. They have no idea if this man is a member of the armed forces, insane, or simply fortunate. They just know that he will eventually return there, open the steps, and go into the darkness. However, this is when the brilliant plan starts to look less ideal. Because nature doesn't follow your rules, even though Cooper had the assurance of a guy who thought he had considered every possibility. That evening, it was chilly, about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Pacific Northwest was experiencing wind gusts and rain. He wasn't exactly dressed for combat. He was dressed in a suit and shoes. No altimeter, no helmet, and no night vision. All you need is a bag of cash, a parachute, and steely nerves. Imagine that leap, 10,000 feet in the dark, over a thick forest, with no idea where you are because navigation wasn't GPS precise at the time. You might land on rocks, in a river, or in trees, or perhaps get trapped in mid-air and never make it to the Earth alive. This would be the scene in Ocean's 11, where the heist team abruptly realizes, "Oh, this might not go the way we planned." Cooper, nevertheless, carried it out. The pilots heard the rush of wind and felt the pressure diminish as the stairs descended. And then, nothing. An empty cabin, a missing hijacker, and the greatest mystery in aviation history were all that remained by the time they touched down. The worst part, though, is that, in retrospect, was Cooper a criminal mastermind, or merely a desperate man risking his life? That's the argument. He was perfect in terms of timing, needs, and psychology, on the one hand. However, he entered some of the most hazardous situations without any survival gear. That is either extreme self-assurance or extreme carelessness. As a pilot, Dan Grider enjoys dissecting this particular piece of the jigsaw. The information makes it clear to him that Cooper wasn't just a fortunate man, He was knowledgeable about aviation and may have even had military parachute instruction. The steps, the altitude, and the plane selection all suggest that the person had done extensive research on aircraft. But after the leap, was that sufficient to keep him alive? This is the point at which the argument becomes heated. In actuality, Cooper's strategy may have been cunning enough to get him off the plane, but it's another matter entirely whether it helped him survive the night. Numerous theories and possibilities, some credible and some plain weird, have been spawned by decades of mystery. Could any of these bizarre theories be real? And who was the man wearing the mask? Suspects, secrets, and speculation. Suspects were a constant in the D.B. Cooper case. Throughout the years, 800 persons have been looked into, questioned, or casually suspected of being the man who leapt into legend. A few suspicions appeared credible. Others, well, let's just say they were more amusing than realistic. In any case, each one gave the story a new dimension. Let's begin with the obvious ones, the men who performed the role and looked the part. Richard Floyd McCoy, a former Army Green Beret who committed a nearly identical crime 2 months after the Cooper hijacking, was one of the first suspects. Like Cooper, he seized a jet, demanded $500,000, and then parachuted off. McCoy was apprehended and given a prison sentence while the money was still crammed into a pillowcase. People naturally questioned whether he could have been Cooper all along, pulling off the ultimate repeat act. The issue is that McCoy didn't fit the physical description. According to witnesses, McCoy was in his 20s and Cooper was in his mid-40s. McCoy was more of a copycat than the actual deal, unless Cooper had a time machine. Then there was Kenneth Christiansen, a former paratrooper who worked for Northwest Airlines. This guy seemed promising on paper. He was skilled at parachuting, had a background in aviation, and had the ideal quiet, restrained demeanor. On his deathbed, Kenneth allegedly confessed, according to his brother, saying something cryptic like, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." It sounds eerie, doesn't it? However, further investigation revealed little more that connected him. Just a lot of coincidences, and a family keen to make connections. No money, no concrete proof. Dwayne Weber was another favorite. According to his wife, Weber murmured, "I'm Dan Cooper," just before he passed away. Reporters couldn't help but notice that kind of deathbed drama. His wife subsequently claimed that he had nightmares about leaving fingerprints on airplanes and that he had once sustained a leg injury similar to what would have happened during a difficult parachute landing. However, the evidence was inconsistent once more. It was similar to attempting to do a puzzle while half of the pieces were in a different box. Then there was World War II. Veteran William J. Smith, who harbored resentment toward the airline sector. He met certain requirements, age, height, and military prowess, but it never quite worked. Like many others, he was never identified as the guy and instead became part of the folklore. Now, some suspects were simply crazy, while others felt at least plausible. Conspiracy theories pro-life. Now, some suspects were simply crazy, while others felt at least plausible. Conspiracy theories proliferated like popcorn over time. Some said Cooper never made it over the jump at all, citing the hazardous terrain below, the bad storm, and the gloomy night. Skeptics argued there's no way he could have survived. However, that merely begs the question, where is the body? Something would have undoubtedly surfaced if a man had dropped from the skies with a bag of cash and a parachute. However, some items did show up. A little child camping on the Columbia River's banks discovered 3 currency packets buried in the sand in 1980. They were rotten and decomposing, yet they were still traceable. Cooper's ransom money matched the serial numbers. Sitting in the soil almost 10 years later was around $5,800 in the 20s. It's still unclear how it got there. Was it buried by Cooper? Was it carried downstream? Or was it set up as a breadcrumb trail of some kind? Nobody knows as of now. Another widely held notion was sparked by this discovery. Perhaps Cooper did not survive, but the money did. According to some investigators, Cooper's bag tore open in the middle of the jump, causing the dollars to wash downriver. Part think it was evidence that Cooper lived long enough to conceal part of the money, maybe as a reserve for a future. In any case, the discovery merely raised further queries. Of them, there are also the genuinely bizarre theories. According to others, Cooper was a woman in disguise. Some contend that he was a CIA agent investigating security flaws. There is even a section of the internet that believes he was an alien or a time traveler, which seems crazy until you remember that this is the internet. All of these theories, however, demonstrate that Cooper is a canvas rather than only a riddle. Everybody projects their own perception of him and the events of that evening. He is seen by some as a criminal mastermind who outwitted the FBI. Others view him as a tragic figure who died before spending any of his riches. He is also regarded by a surprisingly large number of people as a folk hero, akin to Robin Hood in a necktie, who vanished before anyone could catch him. The preoccupation persisted long after the FBI's formal file closed. If anything, it grew more powerful. Every aspect of this case has been examined in books, documentaries, podcasts, and other media. One name has come to light in recent years as someone who may have cracked it wide open. Dan Greider's identification of possible culprits falls into this category. Richard Floyd McCoy is a name that frequently appears in the Cooper rabbit hole. Why? The McCoy relationship. Is he Cooper? People still debate if McCoy was the same person who carried out the most well-known skyjacking in history, since his personal hijacking was so similar to the Cooper plan. Let's go back to April 7, 1972, which was just 5 months after Cooper disappeared. McCoy, a talented helicopter pilot and 29-year-old Vietnam veteran, boarded a United Airlines trip from Denver to Los Angeles. He wasn't exactly fitting in. He was tall, had short hair, was wearing an army jacket, and carried a hand grenade and a revolver. Like Cooper, he also gave the flight attendant a note saying that he needed cash and parachutes. Does that sound familiar? However, this is the point at which it becomes too near for comfort. McCoy demanded 4 parachutes and $500,000, which is more than twice Cooper's $200,000 haul. McCoy gave the order to return the aircraft to the air when the ransom was given during a refueling stop in San Francisco. Then, somewhere over Utah, he got out and vanished into the night. It briefly appeared that Cooper 2.0 had just occurred. The same bold mid-air escape, the same parachute escape plan, and the same hijacking technique. The distinction? McCoy was far less fortunate. Thanks to a tip from a friend who recognized aspects of the incident, authorities were able to locate him in just 2 days. In his home, police discovered both the ransom money and his handwritten hijacking note. What a waste of disappearing into mythology. Despite receiving a 45-year prison term, McCoy didn't exactly stay behind bars. He and several other prisoners staged a crazy escape from a federal prison in 1974 by taking control of a garbage truck and breaking through the gates. His freedom was short-lived. McCoy was shot and killed in Virginia following a standoff with the FBI. He was only 31. This is where conspiracy theories start to surface. McCoy was Cooper all along, according to some investigators, including an FBI agent who worked on both cases. They cited his military experience, his ability to parachute, and the striking parallels between the two hijackings. It fit on paper. Critics, however, weren't persuaded. For starters, witnesses repeatedly portrayed Cooper as being in his 40s, while McCoy was just 29 at the time of Cooper's jump. Additionally, McCoy's appearance had changed. He had shorter hair, a slimmer face, and was not quite the chain-smoking, bourbon-drinking person the stewardesses had remembered. Furthermore, the FBI insisted that McCoy was not Cooper, even if he was a copycat. Nevertheless, McCoy continues to be a top suspect for a lot of amateur detectives. After all, Isn't it at least noteworthy if someone is able to take control of an aircraft, demand parachutes, and disappear into the night twice? Perhaps McCoy was a pupil of Cooper. Or perhaps Cooper was McCoy honing his skills. In any case, his name will always be associated with the D.B. Cooper saga due to the uncanny resemblance. The problem is that if McCoy wasn't Cooper, then the world must have produced two guys who were insane enough to jump out of airplanes while millions were at stake, which might make the enigma much more bizarre. The Cooper media obsession. The problem about D.B. Cooper is that he is now a legend rather than just a hijacker. He has been refined by pop culture into this sleek anti-hero, a man wearing a sharp suit, sipping bourbon, and coolly putting on a parachute like James Bond before vanishing into the night. Songs, novels, documentaries, and even light-hearted allusions in television series like Loki have all addressed him. Cooper is regarded as the man who overcame the system rather than as a criminal. However, Dan Greider's research disproves that notion. The real Cooper, in his opinion, wasn't some debonair sky pirate with movie star swagger. He was, well, rather unremarkable. Yes, a man with expertise in flying. Definitely a nervous dude. But glitzy. Enthusiastic? Not very much. Greider depicts a pragmatic individual, possibly even a little rough around the edges, who was willing to take a risky chance rather than becoming larger than life in order to pull off the jump. To be honest, that's when things start to seem awkward. We don't want D.B. Cooper to be a typical person. We want him to be the renegade hero who lived happily ever after on a tropical island, after sticking it to the man and pocketing the money. The myth is captivating and appealing. It's not nearly as seductive to consider that Cooper may have been a quite average man whose greatest moment was one audacious stunt. Perhaps that's the point, though. Because tales are entertaining but history is complicated, Greider's stark truths force us to distinguish between the man and the legend. Additionally, the untidy version is typically accurate. Cooper most likely didn't land smoothly and walk off smiling. It was uncomfortable, damp, and cold, if he lived at all. He was just a man who hijacked a plane and got away with it, at least temporarily. Not a Robin Hood or a Bond villain. Despite the emergence of new DNA investigation techniques, D.B. Cooper's true identity remains unknown. For more real-life tales like this, subscribe to the channel.